I know that many of you will have some sympathy for me having to stand up here each week and give a speech. I've known quite a few incredibly faithful Christians, strong, committed church people over the years who have said something to me like this: William, Reverend, Pastor, we'll do anything you want for the church. Just don't ask me to get up and preach a sermon. This is understandable. Studies consistently show that people's number one fear is public speaking. And we get that. But it's a bit surprising when you realize what people's number two fear is, and that is death. Comedian Jerry Seinfeld drew the conclusion that means that most of us, if we have to be at a funeral, would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. We're just funny that way. A few years ago, my friend Brian went to see Jerry Seinfeld perform at Massey Hall in Toronto. He paid $100 for his ticket, which was a lot of money at the time, but he didn't regret it one bit, because he said he came out of the theater with his face hurting because he had laughed so much. Comedy and humor like that, the kind that can really make us laugh, is so elusive. We wish we could have it in a bottle or have some kind of formula to call on it when we really need it. So it begs a question for us. What is true comedy? Well, classically, maybe in terms of literature, a comedy is a story with a happy ending, as opposed to a tragedy which has a sad ending. That's the classical definition. Today, we would say that comedy is something that makes us laugh. Of course, the million-dollar question, or if you're Jerry Seinfeld or someone like that, the multi-million-dollar question: what is it that makes us laugh? Well, it's a tough question to answer, but one thing that sometimes makes us laugh is when someone says or does the unexpected. Or in a similar way, when someone has a real gift for setting side by side and in contrast two things that don't really go together. Now, if that's the case, then Jesus must have been a really funny guy, because he was always doing and saying the unexpected. He was always asking people to look at things side by side, which in no way fit together. Last week, for example, right here, we heard a story from Mark's Gospel in which Jesus compared and contrasted our tendency to accumulate and even hoard our wealth and possessions with God's kingdom imperative to share. A few minutes ago, we heard a similar story from Mark's Gospel, where Jesus compared and contrasted power with service, serving and being served. By chapter 10, the Gospel of Mark is reaching its conclusion. Jesus has all but finished his public itinerant ministry. And you know the stories of that well, where he went around the countryside teaching people about God's kingdom and healing the sick and casting out demons. And he's ready to bring his life and activity, his mission, to a climax. And so he's headed to the capital city, Jerusalem, looking in some way to provoke a confrontation with the religious authorities. We know, of course, how that story came to a climax and conclusion with his betrayal and his death. Well, he and his disciples are on the way to Jerusalem for this purpose, and two of his disciples, James and John, who were brothers, came and asked him a question. Teacher, Jesus, if we ask you to do something for us, will you do it? James and John were common names, and so to make sure they know who we're talking about, the gospel writers often refer to them as the sons of Zebedee. And here that's fitting because they're acting a bit like children, using underhanded means to get the answer they want. They wanted Jesus to say yes before he's even heard the question. It's like maybe your children or grandchildren, or maybe you in your youth would ask one parent a question. You didn't get the answer you want, so you go behind their back and ask the other parent the exact same question. Matthew, the other gospel writer, in fact, tells this story and has their mothers ask the question for them. Jesus, like any wise parent or teacher, says, "Well, what's the question?" And they came back. "Well, when you come into your reign and people recognize your authority, we want to be your number one lieutenants." That's a reasonable question. Wouldn't you want to be there? I know I ask that very same question to Andrea every Monday. But see, they see Jesus as Messiah, and rightly so. But in their view, Messiah means he will be the new king of Israel, who once and for all will unite and empower God's people to drive out the foreigners. What they don't understand is that Jesus is not only fulfilling the role of Messiah, he's redefining it. And they don't understand the implications of what it will mean to be standing with him when he comes into his glory. So Jesus rightly asks, are you able to go where I go, and to do what I do, and to experience what I will experience? And they say, yes, we are. So he answers back, well, that is good. Indeed, you will go where I go, do what I do, experience what I experience. But what you have asked is not mine to give, for it is God who grants place and position in the kingdom. Some of you last Tuesday will have watched the U.S. presidential debate as I did. And if you tuned into that debate, what you will have seen is the two candidates in a kind of tug of war, a struggle for power in which they don't use might to gain position, but they use words. We call that rhetoric. And that's what's going on here with the conversation of Jesus with James and John. They're using technique of words and speech and manner and timing to get the upper hand. This fits in well with the argument of French philosopher Michel Foucault, who said that all language, all use of words is an attempt to gain power and position. Now, Jesus has answered in a definitive way the disciples' question. He has said that it is God who gives things and God who grants place in the kingdom. This should have ended the story, but it didn't. James and John went back to the other disciples, and an argument breaks out amongst all of them as to who ought to be the most important and how you ought to go about getting close to Jesus and getting a piece of his fame. And Jesus calls to them all at once. You still don't get it, do you? I, of all people, he said, came not to be served, but to serve. So whoever wants to be great in God's kingdom will be a servant. This ongoing tug of war among Jesus' inner circle about who would be closest to him and who would have the power and authority right next to Jesus, and how they didn't understand what he was saying, no matter how many times he said it, just goes to show how pervasive is the struggle for power in our lives. Michel Foucault, I mentioned him a minute ago, the famous French philosopher. He said that all use of language is an attempt to gain power and is therefore, on some level, very wrong. And yet he could not bring himself, of course, to remain silent. If you did not watch the presidential debate last Tuesday, perhaps you were like Melissa, who I asked her to watch it with me, but she would never watch something like that, finds it so off-putting, finds the name-calling and the lying and the sheer struggle for power distasteful. And if you were among those who didn't watch the debate, chances are you didn't for that very reason. You find it off-putting. And it's not just the American system, it's ours in Canada as well. We see the same thing every time just about there's an election. You know, some define politics as the struggle to see who gets to do what to whom. But it's not just politics, which is overtly about power. In all areas of our life, we see struggle for power. For example, the kind of business transactions that we're involved in on a daily basis are a struggle for power. A few years ago, I was with some friends in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And my friend was haggling with a street vendor over a beautiful leather wallet that he wanted to buy and to take home. He argued with her vehemently, and he talked her down to the equivalent of $1. Unfortunately, he had to walk away from the deal because she wouldn't go to 40 cents. We have power struggles in our homes. We have disputes over finances or values, or maybe, in your case, just the remote control. In churches, we've been trying to understand Jesus and follow his message, adhere to his teaching for some 2,000 years, and yet we have power struggles in the church as well. Not so long ago, I went to a breakfast that was put on for area ministers. There was an outside group who wanted to do a nice thing for the ministers of the community by offering a nice hot breakfast and the opportunity to have some fellowship in an otherwise busy week, and also to hear a good message from a strong preacher brought in from the outside. At my table at this breakfast were two pastors who came from quite different kinds of church traditions and structures. They used that opportunity to get into an argument about whose church more closely resembled the New Testament model. And we know that churches have been caught in power struggles, tugs of war over much less than that. We recognize the struggle for power that is involved in so much of our lives, and we know that this is harmful. When Jesus said it is better to be a servant than to be served, we understand intellectually that he's right. And yet we can't seem, very often at least, to get ourselves out of the vicious cycle of the struggle for power. Is there any way that we might do that? Well, I don't want to say that there's one way for sure, but I'd like to suggest that one possible way to get beyond this struggle for power that we're in so many areas of life is that form of communication which is so useful and so expert at turning things on their heads, and that is comedy. Comedy. For one thing, humor can be very helpful in helping us to get out of our desire for power over others by helping us to take ourselves a little less seriously. The late Morris Boyd is probably the most successful preacher in the history of the United Church of Canada. I don't say necessarily that he was the best preacher or that he was the best minister, but in terms of popularity, he was probably the most successful preacher. He went to Metropolitan United Church in London, a very large congregation, a few hundred people. But by the time his preaching ministry he was in full swing, there were over 2,000 people going to his church on Sunday, most of them specifically just to hear him preach. It was said that one of his favorite phrases, which he believed cut right to the core of the Christian faith and faithfulness, was this: "Oh, come off it. Come off it." Ian Hunter was a friend of Boyd's and a frequent worshiper at Metropolitan. What he says he learned from Boyd's preaching was that humor bears the same relationship to faithfulness as harmony does to music. The self-important and the power seeker seldom laugh, he writes. But if ever the pearly gates swing open for us, we, the true Christians, must surely chuckle, and we can expect to be answered back with a great peal of celestial, heavenly laughter. It is so valuable, friends, to be able to laugh at ourselves and to be able to laugh at the great mysteries of life. Secondly, I think that humor deflates our desire for power because good humor involves a kind of compassion for others. A good humor helps us develop a kind of kinship connection with others. For as we know, the best laughs are always those that we have with others. It is always better to laugh with others than to laugh at someone or something. In the middle decades of the last century, there was a famous Hollywood movie star named James Cagney. I'm sure many of you have enjoyed some of his films over the years. What's little known about Cagney is that he got his start actually as a stand-up comedian. And during the Second World War, he made many trips to visit and address and entertain American troops as one of those who wants to help boost morale. At one point in the Second World War, Cagney was scheduled to be in New York City for some red carpet gala function. That same evening, there was a group of people who were organizing an evening of variety entertainment for soldiers who had been badly wounded in battle, who were no longer useful on the battlefield, so who had been sent home. The organizer got in touch with Cagney because they knew he was interested in that kind of work and asked if he would be able to come and be part of the evening's entertainment. He said that unfortunately he could not because he had this prior commitment that he didn't feel right in breaking. Well, there was some more back and forth, and he finally agreed to try and rearrange his schedule for the evening in such a way that he could come to this variety show for the wounded veterans for maybe 5 minutes. He would go on, say hello, tell a joke, but then he would have to leave and go to his other commitment. Well, when the appointed evening and time arrived, Cagney showed up at this small theater where the wounded soldiers were enjoying their evening. He went on stage at the appointed time, and the organizer, the director of the show, was waiting backstage to shake his hand and to say thank you. 5 minutes passed. Cagney stayed on the stage. Then 10, and then 15 minutes. Finally, 30 and 40 minutes, the director waited backstage for Cagney. There was so much noise and energy and laughter in the theater, you'd think the roof was going to come off. When finally Cagney went off and came backstage, the director thanked him profusely. He said, "That was fantastic. Thank you so much. But tell me, you said you could only come for 5 minutes. What happened?" And so Cagney told him that right down there in the front row were 2 wounded soldiers who were each missing one arm. The one sitting on the right was missing his left arm. The one on the left was missing his right arm, and they were sitting shoulder to shoulder. And the whole time that Cagney was on the stage, they were sitting shoulder to shoulder, clapping their other hands together, one with the left, the other with the right. He was so moved by their smiles and their laughter that there was no way he could get off that stage and go to his red carpet function. Friends, by the grace of God, may you and I find ourselves and our actions and our roles in life a little more humorous and a little less serious. And in so doing, by God's grace, may we find in this an avenue to seek opportunities to serve rather than to be served. I imagine Jesus was a funny guy. I bet around him there were lots of laughs. Even his opponents, his enemies, labeled him a party animal. They thought that was a criticism. And long before Jerry Seinfeld could draw a humorous contrast between our fears of public speaking and death, he was living that reality, wasn't he? He was not afraid of death. He was willing at the funeral to be in the casket, willing to go into the grave. As Paul said in his letter to the Philippians, though he was the image of God, he didn't take equality with God as something to be exploited, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and in becoming human, humbled himself, being obedient to death, even death on a cross. At this point in Jesus' story, he's on his way to Jerusalem to bring his activities to a climax. His story seems headed for tragedy. But in fact, we know that it was a comedy, a story with a happy ending, for it ended not with death, but with resurrection. My story and your story, the stories of James and John and the other disciples, and the stories of all the saints throughout history are really part of this larger story, which is Jesus' divine comedy. Sometimes in our lives, we too seem like we're headed for tragedy. But like Jesus, we know that God promises us a happy ending. And we know that our story will not end with suffering or death, but with resurrection. Our next hymn expresses so well the hope we have in Jesus. The last shall be first, the weak shall be strong, and none shall be afraid, not of death, not even of public speaking. Amen.